So this one will be a relatively short piece. I want to talk for a few minutes about sort of the language that we use to describe um, intergroup relations. The piece that you'll read by Steinberg, or maybe the piece that you've already read by Steinberg, talks very explicitly about how race relations, which is a term that's used quite significantly and frequently in the 20th century among social scientists when they talk about the relationships between racial and ethnic groups, but also more broadly the experiences of racial minorities in the context of the United States. Um, Steinberg talks about how that term is actually sort of an inaccurate label, almost a misdiagnosis of what the problem actually is, which, in his opinion, is racial oppression. And so the argument is that we should talk about that, you know, for what it is, which is a pattern of racial oppression. It isn't just that there's a race relations problem in the United States, it's that there's a problem of systemic and sustained racial oppression, which is a conversation about power and dominance and subordination. And so I want to say a few things about the use of language broadly in our conversations this semester about race and ethnicity, and the experiences of racial and ethnic groups in not just the United States, of course, but in other places around the world. And I want to be really clear. I am not trying to be prescriptive. I don't think that any of you should adopt a particular way of talking about this topic because you've seen somebody else talk about it that way. I think that you're um, if you talk about minorities and majorities, I will understand what that means, and you do not need to worry about sort of couching your language in a certain way. But I do want to talk a little bit about some of the problems with these various approaches. So, for example, when we talk about these various groups of people, racial groups and ethnic groups that make up the United States, uh, when we use the terms majority and minority, we are usually talking about power. We may also be talking about numbers, and that creates a little bit of a problem because you can have a group that is the majority share of a population, but still be a minority group in terms of their actual power. We're looking at a situation just like that in the United States, unfolding probably within the next, say, decade and a half. The United States, by the middle of this century, will be a majority minority country. And you can see right there, there's an issue potentially with the language, that the majority of the people that make up the population of the United States will be members of racial and ethnic minority groups. So majority, minority. When we look at cases like South Africa at the height of apartheid in the late 1980s, we see a situation in which there were 25 million blacks, clearly the numerical majority relative to the 5 million whites, but whites were clearly the majority group in terms of power, right? So when we use majority and minority, um, we probably everybody understands what we mean by that, but because there is the potential for misunderstanding, perhaps those are not the precise terms that we ought to be using. And of course, if one of the things that we want to do is to approach this with a sort of critical and evaluative lens, remember I talked about the importance of accurate descriptions, sort of honest explanations, and sort of frank evaluations, right? So we don't want to just know what people mean. We don't want to just be able to describe the society that we live in if we're, sort of going to be members of a society and not just observers of that society, it may be incumbent on us to think about ways in which we might improve it. And one of the ways that we might improve it is to not be sparing or soft in our critical evaluations, in the language that we use to describe the world that we live in. So what are the alternatives? Well, you could use the language that Steinberg suggests, which is oppressor and oppressed. I think that is an incredibly accurate set of descriptive labels for the power dynamic that exists in a society. I think that for a lot of people, oppressor and oppressed come off as a little bit almost accusatory, right? It puts agency in the hands of the oppressor, and it creates a sort of victim category for the oppressed. And it ignores that I think that you can have, in essence, oppression in the absence of oppressors. You can have the beneficiaries, don't get me wrong. If a group of people is being oppressed, the chances are very good that there is a group of people who are the beneficiaries of that oppression, even if they're not actively engaging in making the oppression happen, right? Simply failing to end the oppression is enough to sort of keep the sort of structural and institutional inequalities that we're going to talk about later in the semester intact and in operation. I tend to use the terms dominant and subordinate. It recognizes that there's a group in a dominant position. It doesn't necessarily implicate the members of that group actively in perpetuating and maintaining the oppression. And so I think any one of these pairings is fine. Again, if you want to talk about majority minority because it's what you're accustomed to or what you're comfortable with, if you want to talk about oppressor and oppressed, that is also completely legitimate. If you want to sort of chart a middle ground and talk a little bit more neutrally, maybe in terms of dominant and subordinate groups, I have no dog in this fight. I know my own preferences, but as somebody who will be talking with you a lot about these things over the course of the semester, I will understand what you mean, regardless of which of these three particular pairings you opt for. Notice that one big happy family or one large pool of equally positioned people is not one of the options, right? We definitely have a society that is characterized by inequality between racial and ethnic groups, and to try to pretend otherwise I think, again, it's going to do a disservice to any kind of honest description and analysis and evaluation of what that society is like, how it works, and the ways in which it needs to be changed. So again, let's be clear on what we mean by these terms, regardless of which you're going to use. When we talk about a majority group or a dominant group or an oppressor group, we're talking about a social group that is dominant in a society. In our case, when we are talking about race or ethnicity in the United States, we are going to be talking about whites as the dominant group, as the majority group. Well, if we want to get into ethnicity, specifically Northern and Western European whites are the majority group, the dominant group, the oppressor group. The minority group is any group that is assigned a subordinate role in society. That means it has a less than proportionate share of things like wealth, power, and social status, whereas the dominant group or the majority group has a greater than proportionate share of the wealth, the power, or the social status in a society. So, for example, if we look at poverty, right? Poverty as an economic condition, just setting aside that we should probably work to end poverty. When we look at the distribution of poverty, we see that poverty is unequally distributed, right? So, for example, blacks are about 13%, a little more than 13% of the total population of the United States, but they make up about there's a 26% poverty rate among African Americans. So um, they are disproportionately represented among the poor. If poverty were equally distributed, then 13% of poor people in the United States would be African American or Black, because that's their proportion in the population overall. But we see that they are overrepresented among the poor. They are overrepresented among the population that is incarcerated. They are overrepresented along a number of those various different dimensions. And so that's what we mean by a proportionate or disproportionate share of things like wealth, power, and social status. So again, it's language, but language is very, very important because language becomes um, um, critical to how we construct an understanding of the world around us. Language plays a really fundamental role in taking sensation, which is the inputs that we get from the external world around us and that come into our awareness through one or more of our five senses. Those sensations become perception as that information is carried to the brain, and our brain uses various resources to conceptualize and categorize those sensory experiences. And the cultural resource that we use to do that is the resource of language. So how we talk about things shapes how those things become part of our understanding of the reality around us. So we'll talk a lot more about this over the course of the semester, but I wanted to make sure that everyone had a pretty clear understanding of the importance of language.